From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters. Since the late summer, the Ontario government has been under pressure to ease some of the burdens so many are facing right now. No jobs, no rent money. This year, a lifeline. For now, Ontario has put a pause on evictions for non-payment of rent, like it had during the first wave last spring. But the numbers are staggering. More than 4,500 eviction notices went before Ontario's Landlord and Tenant Board in December of last year, alone. Tenants advocates call it an eviction crisis, and landlords say they've lost control of their properties. On This Matters, we turn to Victoria Gibson, reporter for the Toronto Star who covers affordable housing inside the mass eviction notices in Ontario and how the rent always comes due, one way or another. Victoria, thanks so much for your time.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
We've heard this term eviction crisis being used in the GTA and through parts of Ontario. How would you describe what the state of the system is right now?
So when we talk about evictions in Ontario, there are a number of different kinds. There are evictions for renovations where a landlord wants to use their own property, evictions for specific issues. But the kind of eviction that I'd say has attracted the most attention during COVID-19, given that we've seen people losing jobs, working fewer hours, are these eviction applications where a tenant has missed their rent payments or came up short. So there are two different kinds of notices for those cases. And just to keep it simple, we'll divide it into two. There are N4s, those are notices given to tenants, and Tribunals Ontario doesn't track those. And there are L1s, which are formal applications that a landlord has to file to get a hearing at the Landlord and Tenant Board. And those are tracked in Ontario. So during the first pandemic eviction moratorium, and we'll chat in a bit about that versus the current moratorium, I'm sure, but property owners were still able to file L1s even though actual evictions weren't taking place. So during that period, there were 6,770 applications to evict tenants who had fallen behind on their rent, fallen into arrears. And while that was a clear decrease from 2019, that was still more than 6,000 people in Ontario who are potentially facing the loss of their homes during a health crisis, which is what alarmed a lot of people. You know, of course, not all those cases go to hearings. There are a number of things that can happen along the way. Tenants can repay their arrears. Someone can sign a repayment plan. Somebody could even pack up and leave because they don't think they'll be able to pay the money back. And in those cases, L1s can be withdrawn or the resolution is noted at a hearing. And even if an eviction is ordered, tenants can still sometimes stay if they pay their arrears by a certain date. But the threat of a possible eviction during a pandemic is what's been flagged to me as a concern at this current point. The pivot to electronic hearings because of the pandemic restrictions has also been a really complicating factor in the last year. One of the issues that came up, for example, I wrote about this back in the fall, was that emailed hearing notices weren't arriving or they were getting caught in junk filters and people were left not knowing about their hearings, blind to the fact they were happening, including some lawyers involved in these cases. I spoke to one tenant who claimed her notice was sent to a misspelled address, which seems like a very simple problem, but her landlord was actually granted an eviction order in her absence. So the stakes are really, really high. And now that we're in this second residential eviction moratorium, this one does look a little bit different than the last one. The Landlord-Tenant Board is still holding hearings. They can still issue eviction orders. They just can't be enforced versus last time around when everything was shut down for a couple of months. And at this point in the pandemic, both landlords and tenants have expressed concern with me about the sheer amount of arrears that's owed by some of those who've fallen behind. In some cases, we're talking about more than $10,000 owed back to maintain a tenancy. So that's sort of a snapshot of what we've been seeing since the pandemic hit on the eviction front.
So just to be clear, when it comes to those L1s, of which there have been thousands and thousands issued, those are notices of eviction. It doesn't mean that somebody will be evicted, but it starts the legal process with the Landlord and Tenant Board.
It does, yes. It's an application where the landlord puts forward, my tenant has fallen behind on rent and I would like to start this process and move towards a hearing.
I wanted to get eventually to that second moratorium that you mentioned there, but I'll start first with your report about this trove of data on evictions, looking at 25 postal codes that have seen eviction notices in Toronto. What story does that data tell us?
So what our story this weekend did was look at the postal codes that were listed on every L1 filing during that first moratorium. And we took a look at the locations where the most applications were filed in those months. And what we found was that 2 postal codes that cover one East York complex that's run by Pinedale Properties were listed on more eviction filings for missed rent than any other postal codes across Ontario during those months. There were 85 combined applications across those 2 postal codes. And our story also found that across those 25 postal codes you mentioned, with the most L1s, between March 17th and August 1st, there were 3 companies that had buildings at multiple addresses. And those were Pinedale, Medallion Corporation, and Rainey Management. So Rainey didn't provide the Star with any comment. Both Pinedale and Medallion did. Both said that none of their L1 applications had resulted in evictions to date. Pinedale said that it had filed applications when tenants didn't respond to communications from the company, and argued that in some cases, filing an L1 was required to get a tenant to focus on addressing their rent arrears. Most of the tenants were still meeting their rent obligations, the company told me, and about a quarter of its L1 cases are still underway. So that means they're waiting for a hearing or some other resolution. Medallion suggested that looking at aggregate L1 data could be misleading and cited privacy constraints on discussing the details of individual cases. The company stated that it was trying to resolve any issues still lingering in a fair, compassionate, and responsible way wherever that is possible. But others I spoke to were questioning why these larger companies actually chose to trigger these formal eviction processes against their tenants who'd fallen into arrears early during COVID-19, even though they were entitled to do so by law. So I spoke with Kareem Assad, who's a lawyer who works with both tenants and landlords, and she argued that filing an L1 could be seen as a pressure tactic. And while she said smaller landlords in Ontario may actually be facing substantial financial pressure if even one of their tenants fell behind, she believes that larger companies are likely in a better position to handle the arrears without formal eviction filings. So that's sort of the tension that came up when we're reporting this story.
So in this story specifically, too, it's about these large property management companies. You weren't focusing necessarily on smaller landlords or people who were taking care of individual properties. These are property management companies that own multiple apartment buildings and manage multiple apartment buildings.
That's correct, yeah.
We'll be right back. We can talk to you about the landlords, because I know you spoke to the organization that represents Ontario landlords. They cite rent shortfall, that people aren't paying their rents. What is that actual number, though, that is missing due to what's happening with the pandemic?
Yeah, so I spoke with the Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario, and their estimate at this point is that roughly 4% of rent across the province hasn't been paid during the pandemic. But that doesn't mean that, there aren't these individual cases that have quite high arrears numbers, and that's what they're really concerned with at this point. And one thing that was really interesting to me is that both that landlord group and the Advocacy Centre for Tenants Ontario both suggested the same fix. They're both suggesting there is some kind of rent relief program from the province that could step in and lower those amounts so that people are sort of facing more reasonable rent repayment prospects, as opposed to looking at these $10,000, $20,000 numbers and wondering how they're going to pay that back on top of their regular rent.
I also wanted to talk about Bill 184. Its official, very legal name is Protecting Tenants and Strengthening Community Housing Act. A real mouthful. But in practice, though, what does it actually do?
So Bill 184 is definitely another layer to this conversation. Last year, the Ford government changed several rules around landlord and tenant issues. And among those changes was one particularly controversial provision. And that allows tenants to be evicted without a hearing if they fall behind on agreed upon repayment plans for their rent arrears. So the government says the law is meant to encourage negotiated settlements. And the Federation of Rental Housing Providers, their president has told me before he's endorsed the idea of having alternative dispute resolution channels. But tenant advocates have raised concerns about renters potentially agreeing to plans to avoid being evicted, but then falling behind on those plans as the pandemic continues to take a toll on the economy. And Toronto City Council actually voted last summer to challenge Bill 184 in court. Nothing has been filed in that case as of a few days ago. So we'll see how that process all plays out, but it's definitely been a factor in the eviction cases that have played out since last year.
So is it that tenants advocates are saying that these repayment plans, they can be taken advantage of by some landlords of essentially leveraging the desperation of some people to keep their apartments in their homes and them being at a disadvantage then?
I'm sure that could be a concern. I'm hearing a number of different concerns on that front. One being, people may agree to something and then their economic situation changes. Obviously, we've seen different degrees of lockdown and business closures with the pandemic. So somebody's work situation in July, say, might be different than their work situation today. And that's been highlighted as a concern to me in a pandemic where we don't necessarily have an end date at this point. We don't know what it's going to look like over the next couple of months. One of the big concerns flagged to me is that a tenant who agrees to a repayment plan thinking they have a certain amount of income, and if that changes and they fall behind, they could potentially be evicted without going to another hearing.
The Ontario government also has a role to play here because they have been criticized for their lack of action from both tenants and landlords. We remember during COVID first wave, you mentioned this, that there was a moratorium, a pause on residential evictions. Now that moratorium is back after it originally ended in August. How is it different from the first one?
Yeah. So during the first moratorium, we saw everything sort of grind to a halt. There weren't any non-emergent hearings at the landlord and tenant board. So while landlords were still able to file eviction applications, they weren't being heard. There weren't any decisions being made. So it's sort of just all of the applications for that period piled up and had to be dealt with after the moratorium lifted and operations started again.
It was a complete freeze in the first one.
Essentially, yes. There was still sort of an opportunity for some emergency cases to be heard, but it was more or less a total stop. And this time that didn't happen. The landlord and tenant board is able to continue holding their hearings in this current period. They're able to actually issue eviction orders. It's just a case where they can't be enforced. So, a sheriff's office can't go in and remove somebody from their home. And that applies to both new orders and orders that had been issued but not carried out before the moratorium started.
Okay, so the notices can still come out in the second moratorium, even if they aren't necessarily acted upon before the board?
Exactly. So an adjudicator at the landlord and tenant board can approve an eviction notice. It can't be enforced. That person is able to stay in their home until the moratorium lifts.
Okay, so in any case, though, a moratorium is only meant to be a pause on eviction notices and the situation at hand because of the pandemic. But eventually, these notices will have to be dealt with, and we don't know what the economic situation will be then. Is there something that both tenants and landlords want to see that is more of a long-term answer and not just a pause, something that's temporary, that a moratorium is?
Yeah, I think that's where the conversation around rent relief comes in. And that's, as I mentioned, something that we've heard from both landlord and tenant groups, is they would like to see a program where potentially the provincial government will step in, create a program that will alleviate some of the arrears that tenants are facing without the landlords necessarily having to give that money up. So, the government would step in and pay an amount, whether directly to the landlords or through some other channel, to bring those amounts down, to give people sort of a more reasonable chance at repaying the arrears that they've fallen into this far into the pandemic. So that's something that we've definitely seen both sides pushing for, that they said would be helpful to maintain these tenancies and keep people in their homes.
Right, something a bit more fundamental that would address why the challenge of meeting rent and the structural problems at hand, and not just a pause.
That's the idea, yes.
Okay, Victoria, thank you for breaking this down for us.
My pleasure. Thanks for taking the time.
And that is Victoria Gibson, reporter for the Toronto Star. Victoria covers affordable housing through the Local Journalism Initiative. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Mutar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.